Okay, first up, a couple things about due dates. So creative writing was due on Friday to me yet. Please get it to me by the end of the day today. We still have poetry coming up towards the end of the quarter. The Inferno test, Thursday. Obviously, we couldn't have it then. It's going to be moved to tomorrow. So we'll have that in class tomorrow. Guys who are online, I'm going to upload that as a Juno pod for you to work on. Let me know if you have questions about that. In addition, today I'm going to give out the instructions for our next response paper. This is not going to be due until Wednesday. Not yet gotten to any of the text of Romeo and Juliet, but I want to get this assigned so that when we do start reading through the Tales from Shakespeare version, because a lot of those plot points and things the characters say are still going to be relevant there. So you can start thinking about them now. That'll be due on the 3rd, so that's next Wednesday. So next due date is the creative writing. Really should have been done already, but get it to me tonight if you haven't. The Inferno test tomorrow, response paper next week, and the poetry at the end of, or towards. I'll go up the instructions. Yeah, because our next festival day is the 25th of March. Here are the directions for the next response paper. No surprises there. Here's about Romeo and Juliet. Of Romeo and Juliet that we've read together. So by the time that we get to next week, there's a couple scenes of the book. Certainly still in Act 1. Describe your reaction to some character, event, theme, or other aspect of the book. Here, this is talking about your reaction. What are your thoughts about this? How did you respond to this emotionally or mentally? This is a short paper. You don't have time to focus on multiple aspects of the book. Just pick one. It's Romeo's obsession with this other girl at the beginning of the book. It can be positive or negative. You don't have to like it. But you have to support it with material from the book and good reasoning. You don't have to use any external sources. I recommend against it, but you can if you really want to. But please make sure to quote directly from the play and cite your quotes. So tell me what act it comes from, what scene, and then what line within the scene. So you might say, for example, Act 1, Scene 5, line 13. And then I can look exactly, find exactly where it is in that text. And like I said, we'll probably start reading the text together in another couple days. But you can at least start thinking about these now. Questions about those? Okay, I want to talk briefly about another one of these sonnets here, another one of the poems that I've signed on this sheet. The other sonnet here, I'm just going in order through the play. So we talked about the prologue at the very beginning of the play. That's a sonnet. We also have this sonnet on the front side there, the duet sonnet between Romeo and Juliet. Notice the R and J I've got marked there. That's which one of them says these lines. The two of them say a sonnet together when they first meet. It's a sonnet. And Shakespeare wrote a lot of sonnets, most of them not part of his plays, but a lot of his sonnets have to do with love, and so it's appropriate that Romeo and Juliet's first conversation here be a love sonnet. I don't want to spend too much time on this because we're going to take a closer look at it when we get to the scene, as is the case with all of these. But I do want to read it together, and talk about some of the words here, because it's really important to understand this sonnet, to understand the imagery and the cultural background here between it. So the first quatrain is spoken by Romeo. If I profane with my unworthiest hand this holy shrine, the gentle fine is this. My lips, two blushing pilgrims, ready stand to smooth that rough touch with a tender kiss. And Juliet responds, the next quatrain. Good pilgrim, you do wrong your hand too much, which mannerly devotion shows in this. For saints have hands that pilgrims' hands do touch, and palm to palm is holy palmer's kiss. Romeo then says, have not saints lips, and holy palmers too? Juliet, I, pilgrim, lips that they must use in prayer. Romeo, oh then, dear saint, let lips do what hands do. They pray, grant thou, lest faith turn to despair. Juliet, saints do not move, though grant for prayer's sake. Romeo, then move not while my prayers effect, I take. And then they kiss. A very lovely little sonnet here. But let's talk about some of the vocab here so we start to get a sense of the theme. First up, what's a shrine? like a church. Not necessarily a church, but yes, a holy place dedicated or other holy person. Is a shrine. In a Christian context, it's going to be associated with particular saints and usually involve some relic of the saint, either their entire body or some part of their body. So, for example, up in Emmitsburg, if you go up 270, you keep going onto, 70 up there. You keep going north towards Pennsylvania. Up there, there's a shrine to St. Elizabeth Ann Seton, who worked in that area. And then her tomb is in the church there. It's a shrine to her. It's a place dedicated to her. So that's a shrine, a holy place. And here in this context, we're talking a Christian context, dedicated to a saint. And Romeo here talks about this holy shrine, and it's Juliet's hand that he's touching. He's holding her hand, and he refers to it as a holy shrine. And he says, if I profane with my unworthiest hand this holy shrine, what does it mean to profane something? Or what does the word profane mean? You know that word? So that's profane. We often talk about profanity. Something that's profane is not sacred. It's not necessarily a bad thing. It doesn't necessarily mean unholy, like in a negative way. It doesn't necessarily mean evil, but something that's profane is not sacred. So, for example, if someone who is certain religious items touches them, that would be profaning those items. It would be a profanation, or a sacrilege is another word that's often used, which is Latin for picking up something sacred. If you're not supposed to pick up the sacred thing and you pick it up, you're profaning it because you're taking something that's not sacred and you're touching something sacred with it. Romeo says, I have this unworthiest hand, this very unworthy hand, and I'm touching this holy shrine. I'm profaning it by doing that. And what does this word fine mean here? It doesn't mean nice or thin, good. Profane with my unworthiest hand this holy shrine. The gentle fine is this. It's a fine.
It's like apple. It's something you aim to do.
Nope. When might you get fined? Yeah, if you break a law, you might have to pay a fine. You might have to pay speeding. If you park your car someplace where you're not allowed to, you might have to pay a fine. And so Romeo says, well, if I'm profaning your hand, I'm going to have to pay a fine. But it's a gentle fine. And what is the fine that he says he's going to have to pay? My lips stand at the ready, ready stand. That's how he'll make up for taking this beautiful. Call his lips. He calls them two blushing pilgrims. What is a pilgrim? From the Latin peregrinos.
Oh, isn't Dante a pilgrim?
Dante is referred to as a pilgrim in the Inferno. Why? What is a pilgrim? What is a pilgrimage? That's what a pilgrim does.
Someone who goes
Someone who goes around, but there's something else to it. Not only is it a religious traveler, someone who's going on a journey to a shrine or to some other sacred place. So in Shakespeare's time, and for the long time before that, there were practices of going to different places on a pilgrimage. What are some places that someone living in Shakespeare's time might have gone on pilgrimage to? There are a few major ones. Dante talks about one of them in the Inferno at one point, when we have the Male Bolge. We first see the Male Bolge. Dante talks about a particular pilgrimage that a lot of people made. What are the holiest places in Christian Europe? Rome, right? St. Peter's, to the shrine of the tomb of Saints Peter and Paul. Romans 1. There are three other big ones in Shakespeare's day and age. Jerusalem being the second one. Really, actually more important than Rome. Jerusalem, Rome are the first two. And then the other two big ones that people would go to in Europe and still do many places. The other two are Santiago de Compostela in northwestern Spain, the shrine of St. James. People would go all the way across Europe to get there. It's almost at the very western end of Europe. You can still do that pilgrimage. You can hike along there. And then the other big one in England at the time is Canterbury, the shrine of St. Thomas Becket. And that's in the Middle English work, the Canterbury Tales. That takes place during a pilgrimage to Canterbury. So he describes his lips as pilgrims. They're pilgrims that have come to the shrine, but then they've profaned it. His hand has profaned the shrine, and his lips are going to make up for that by paying this penalty of kissing the shrine, of showing proper respect to this holy object, he says. And how does Juliet respond to this? She says, good pilgrim. She calls him pilgrim. She's going to pick up on this metaphor that he's using. Romeo has compared himself to a pilgrim and has compared her hand to a holy shrine. And she's going to go along with this. She calls him good pilgrim. You do wrong your hand too much. You're being unfair to your hand. Which mannerly devotion shows in this? Your hand is showing devotion. This is an act of devotion here. First, you get to the tomb at the end. And really, ideally, what you want to do, you came all that way, you ideally would touch the actual body of the saint. But if you can't, you at least touch a very famous statue of St. Peter, made of bronze. And his foot has been rubbed smooth and shiny because people always touch the foot on this statue as they walk past. This is a sign of devotion. So she says he's a pilgrim, and his hand is showing devotion in the way that it touches the shrine. For saints have hands, either meaning their physical hands of the dead body or the hand of the statue, that pilgrims' hands do touch. And, she says, palm to palm is holy Palmer's kiss. So palm to palm, the hands meeting like this, is the kiss that palmers show. A palmer is a pilgrim to Jerusalem. That's what a palmer is. Because they would carry palm branches as a sign of their pilgrimage. That's a pilgrim going to Jerusalem. She says, no, actually, you don't need to pay a fine. You don't need to kiss my hand because this is actually a sign of devotion. Well, Romeo wasn't really apologizing. He was really asking permission to kiss her. And he says, have not saints lips and holy palmers too? Well, don't saints have lips also? Right, the pilgrims can touch their hands as devotion. They have lips too, right? Right, Juliet? Yes. And holy palmers, pilgrims have lips too. And she says, yes, pilgrim, yes, lips that they must use in prayer. She's being coy here. She says, well, I could show devotion to you using my lips, he says. She says, well, you're a pilgrim, right? So your lips, often when you make a pilgrimage, it's to show special respect for that particular saint, ask a favor from that saint for them to help you in some way. He says, oh then, dear saint, let lips do what hands do. Let my lips do what my hand is doing. They pray. My lips are praying because you don't grant my request, which is to let my lips show devotion the way that my hand is showing devotion. And Juliet, again, being coy, says, saints do not move. The statues or the body of the saint doesn't move. They'll grant for prayer's sake. Even if the saint grants it, the statue is not going to move. The body of the saint is not going to move. He says, I'm not going to go out of my way for this. And he says, then move not. Then don't move while my prayer's effect I take. While I take the thing that results from my prayer. A very nice little sonnet there with this image here of pilgrimage. Romeo treating her like something holy. And Juliet playing along with this. All right, questions about that? I think there's enough time on that. All right. So make sure you pick one of these by this point. You really should have picked one, and start working on it. If you're going to do one of the sonnets, we've talked about both of those. Make sure you know what the words mean. If you're picking one of the other ones, great. You'll get extra credit. We will talk about those over the next few days. But make sure you know how to pronounce these words, you know what they mean, and that you understand the gist of the whole speech, so that you can, when you're reciting it, convey that meaning to your audience. So let's take out the Tales from Shakespeare again. We have made it to page 250. 250, Romeo, the morning after meeting Juliet, has come to his old friend, Friar Lawrence, and told him how much he's fallen in love. He says, will you marry us? And instead of saying no or wait, Friar Lawrence says, yeah, all right. You guys seem really interested in this, and it might smooth things over between your families. So he doesn't slow Romeo and Juliet down. If anything, he encourages them. So picking up there, that paragraph at the bottom of 250 that starts with now. Now was Romeo blessed indeed, and Juliet, who knew his intent from a messenger, which he had dispatched according to promise, did not fail to be early at the cell of Friar Lawrence, where there and long dissensions of their families. So they're married the next morning. The ceremony being over, Juliet hastened home, where she stayed, impatient for the coming of night, at which time Romeo promised to come and meet her in the orchard where they had met the night before. And the time between seemed as tedious to her as the night before some great festival seems to an impatient child that has got new finery, which it may not put on till the morning. That same day about noon, Romeo's friends, Benvolio and Mercutio, walking through the streets of Verona, were met by a party of the Capulets, with the impetuous Tybalt at their head. This was the same angry Tybalt who would have fought with Romeo at old Lord Capulet's feast. He, seeing Mercutio, accused him bluntly of associating with Romeo, a Montague. Mercutio, who had as much fire and youthful blood in him as Tybalt, replied to this accusation with some sharpness. And in spite of all Benvolio could say to moderate their wrath, a quarrel was beginning. When Romeo himself, passing that way, the fierce Tybalt turned from Mercutio to Romeo and gave him the disgraceful appellation of villain. Romeo wished to avoid a quarrel with Tybalt above all men, because he was the kinsman of Juliet, and much beloved by her. Besides, this young Montague had never thoroughly entered into the family quarrel, being by nature wise and gentle, and the name of a Capulet, which was his dear lady's name, was now rather a charm to allay resentment than a watchword to excite fury. So he tried to reason with Tybalt, whom he saluted mildly by the name of good Capulet, as if he, though a Montague, had some secret pleasure in uttering that name. But Tybalt, who hated all Montagues as he hated sort of calm, dishonorable submission, with many disdainful words provoked Tybalt to the prosecution of his first quarrel with him. And Tybalt and Mercutio fought, till Mercutio fell, receiving his death's wound while Romeo and Benvolio were vainly endeavoring to part the combatants. Mercutio being dead, Romeo kept his temper no longer, but returned the scornful appellation of villain which Tybalt had given him. And they fought till Tybalt was slain by Romeo. After the wedding, Juliet goes home. She's waiting for Romeo to come that night. Romeo's friends are hanging out. Tybalt finds them, not having forgotten that Romeo crashed the party the night before. Tries to pick a fight with them. Romeo shows up. He feels very differently about Tybalt now than he did before. She's Juliet's relative. Juliet is fond of her cousin. He says, Tybalt, I don't want to fight you. Good Capulet. Of course, he doesn't tell them why. His friends think he's being weak. They pick a fight back with Tybalt. Mercutio is killed, and Romeo kills Tybalt. Things continue to escalate very, very quickly here. And notice that the secret nature of Romeo and Juliet's marriage is part of what causes this. If Tybalt had known, maybe he would have acted differently. But he doesn't know. Romeo doesn't tell him. And his friends don't know either, so they can't act with that in mind either. This dead their wives, and soon after arrived the prince himself, who being related to Mercutio, whom Tybalt had slain, and having had the peace of his government often disturbed by these brawls of Montagues and Capulets, came determined to put the law in strictest force against those who should be found to be offenders. Benvolio, who had been eyewitness to the fray, was commanded by the prince to relate the origin of it, which he did, keeping as near to the truth as he could without injury to Romeo, softening and excusing the part which his friends took in it. Lady Capulet, whose extreme grief for the loss of her kinsman Tybalt made her keep no bounds in her revenge, exhorted the prince to do strict justice upon his murderer, and to pay no attention to Benvolio's representation, who being Romeo's friend and a Montague, spoke partially. Thus she pleaded against her new son-in-law, but she knew not yet that he was her son-in-law and Juliet's husband. On the other hand was to be seen Lady Montague pleading for her child's life, and arguing with some justice that Romeo had done nothing worthy of punishment in taking the life of Tybalt, which was already forfeited to the law by having slain Mercutio. The prince, unmoved by the passionate exclamations of these women, on a careful examination of the facts pronounced his sentence. By that sentence, Romeo was banished from Verona. This time, the fights in the street have gone too far. The Prince of Verona, his relative Mercutio, has died here. The Capulets and the Montagues are both upset. He's in a difficult spot here. Obviously, he wants to do justice here, but he also needs to make sure that there isn't a full-on war between the Montagues and the Capulets. Whatever he does has to appease both sides. The Capulets want Romeo dead. The Montagues want him totally let off the hook. And so he takes a sort of middle course and banishes Romeo from Verona, sent into exile, like another Italian that we saw this year, sent to exile from his home city, Dante. Heavy news to young Juliet, who had been but a few hours a bride, and now by this decree seemed errant, a fiend angelical, a ravenous dove, a lamb with a wolf's nature, a serpent heart hid with a flowering face, and other like contradictory names, which denoted the struggles in her mind between her love and her resentment. But in the end, love got the mastery, and the tears which she shed for grief that Romeo had slain her cousin turned to drops of joy that her husband lived, whom Tybalt would have slain. Then came fresh tears, and they were altogether of grief for Romeo's banishment. That word was more terrible to her than the death of many Tybalts. Romeo, after the fray, had taken refuge in Friar Lawrence's cell, where he was first made acquainted with the prince's sentence, which seemed to him far more terrible than death. To him, it appeared there was no world out of Verona's walls, no living out of the sight of Juliet. Heaven was there where Juliet lived, and all beyond was purgatory, torture, hell. The good friar would have applied the consolation of philosophy to his griefs. But this frantic young man would hear of none. But like a madman, he tore his hair and threw himself all along upon the ground, as he said, to take the measure of his grave. From this unseemly state, he was roused by a message from his dear lady, which a little revived him. And then the friar took the advantage to expostulate with him on the unmanly weakness which he had shown. He had slain Tybalt, but would also slay himself, slay his dear lady who lived but in his life. The noble form of man, he said, was but a shape of wax when it wanted the courage which should keep it firm. The law had been lenient to him, that instead of death, which he had incurred, had pronounced by the prince's mouth only banishment. He had slain Tybalt, but Tybalt would have slain him. There was a sort of happiness in that. Juliet was alive, and beyond all hope had become his dear wife. Therein he was most happy. All these blessings, as the friar made them out to be, did Romeo put from him like a sullen, misbehaved wench. The friar bade him beware, for such as despaired, he said, died miserable. Then when Romeo was a little calmed, he counseled him that he should go that night and secretly take his leave of Juliet, and thence proceed straightways to Mantua, at which place he should sojourn till the friar found fit occasion to publish joy that he went forth with grief. Romeo was convinced by these wise counsels of the friar, and took his leave to go and seek his lady, proposing to stay with her that night, and by daybreak pursue his journey alone to Mantua, to which place the good friar promised to send him letters from time to time, acquainting him with the state of affairs at home. Romeo's been hiding with his friend Friar Lawrence again. To him, this seems worse than death to be separated from Juliet, to be banished from Verona. Heaven is where Juliet is. Again, we see this imagery similar to their first meeting, where he calls Juliet a saint. He's sort of losing it. Friar Lawrence actually has some good advice for him. He says, look, the prince could have ordered you executed. He didn't. It's just banishment. You're married to Juliet. That's great. So Romeo goes. Juliet has sent for him. He goes. He spends the night with his wife. Doing situation here. But I'm going to try to find a good moment to publish your marriage, to make it known publicly, and then everyone will be happy and can come back, and it'll be great. Everything will be fine. Kind of optimistic. Imagine that Friar Lawrence is going to have to deal with some of the fallout from that. But that's where he leaves Romeo. Let's one more paragraph today. That night, Romeo passed with his dear wife, gaining secret admission to her chamber from the orchard in which he had heard her confession of love the night before. So we're now 24 hours after they found each other's society. We're sadly elated with the prospect of parting and the fatal adventures of the past day. The unwelcome daybreak seemed to come too soon, and when Juliet heard the morning song of the lark, she would have persuaded herself that it was the nightingale which sings by night. But it was too truly the lark which sang, and a discordant and unpleasing note it seemed to her. And the streaks of day in the east, too, certainly pointed out that it was time for these lovers to part. Romeo took his leave of his dear wife with a heavy heart, promising to write to her from Mantua every hour in the day. And when he had descended, in the bottom of a tomb. Romeo's mind misgave him in like manner, but now he was forced hastily to depart, for it was death for him to be found within the walls of Verona after daybreak. We'll pause there for now. There's a solution here, a sort of temporary resolution. Things had escalated to this fight between Romeo and Tybalt, open bloodshed between the two families, and then it calms down a bit. Romeo's banished. Okay, he and Juliet get to spend the night together. He leaves. And things are calm for a while, but they're not fully resolved yet. There's still the issue of making this marriage publicly known and reconciling their families to that fact. Thank you very much. Don't forget the things that are due. The test tomorrow, the response paper next week, the creative writing if you haven't submitted that yet. Thank you very much.